My name is Rob Tappan, and on behalf of the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, I'd like to welcome you to today's conference entitled The Impact of War on Religious Freedom. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Secretary Pompeo and the State Department for calling this first ever ministerial to advance religious freedom. This week has provided us with a unique opportunity to stand in solidarity with those suffering from religious persecution across the globe, share different points of view and approaches, and to develop strategies to protect religious freedom around the world. Before we get started, I'd like to say a brief word about our host today. One of the things that I admire most about the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy is their ability, especially in today's polarizing and partisan climate, to bring together both Republicans and Democrats to discuss and actually often agree upon a vision for elevating the role of the Constitution in American foreign policy. In their own words, the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy believes that the United States must pursue a realistic and restrained foreign policy. Foundational to responsible and thoughtful foreign policy is the need for congressional consent for all acts of war. Too often, Congress has taken a back seat in directing military actions, acquiescing to the President. The Constitution spells out in Article 1 that the authority to authorize war comes exclusively from Congress. As we gather here today in the halls of Congress to discuss how wars around the world impact religious freedom, but not just any wars specifically. In our second panel, we hope to address how America's wars, many of them not authorized by Congress whatsoever, impact religious minorities in the Middle East and around the world. And more than simply raise awareness, we are here to discuss what specific actions Congress can take to promote religious freedom through a more peaceful, responsible, thoughtful, and constitutional foreign policy. This morning's conference has three components to it. We will begin by setting the historical stage for our conversation with the first panel that will focus on the impact of war on religious freedom in past conflicts. Then, we are tremendously honored to be joined by the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom and former Kansas Governor Sam Brownback, and to hear about his vital work on this important topic. Before moving to our first panel, which discusses the impact of current wars on religious freedom, I'd like to invite the members of our first panel to come forward. I'm proud to introduce Ron Dreher, who will be facilitating our discussion. And by way of introduction, Ron Dreher is a senior editor of the American Conservative. He has written and edited for the New York Post, the Dallas Morning News, National Review, the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, the Washington Times, and Baton Rouge Advocate. Rod's commentary has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Commentary, the Weekly Standard, BeliefNet, and Real Simple, among other publications. And he has appeared on NPR, ABC News, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and the BBC. He lives in St. Francisville, Louisiana, with his wife Julie and their 3 children. He has also written 4 books: The Little Way of Ruthie, Learning, Crunchy Cons, How Dante Can Save Your Life, and The Benedict Option. So without further ado, Rod, please take the podium.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you everybody for coming out this morning. We're here today to talk about war and its effect on religious liberty, and we're going to hear from a variety of perspectives here on the panel this morning. But I want to share with you something very personal that happened to me earlier this year. I was in France to promote the French edition of my book, The Benedict Option, which is about how to preserve Christianity in a post-Christian world. This is an urgent issue in France, and I'd been invited to stay at the home of some French Catholics, a farm family in the far north of France, and I was talking to them about the effect of World War I on the faith in France, and my host said, well, you know, that happened right here in our backyard, and they meant it literally. I went into the forest behind their house. They took me there and showed me what was left of the trenches, and we talked about the absolutely catastrophic effect of war on their villages right there in the Somme. And I saw photographs. I met an elderly woman who had been a little girl who greeted as a little girl the American liberators that came through. It made a very powerful impression on me, particularly in connection with the reason I was in France in the first place, a place where Christianity is desperately trying to stay alive. It became quite clear to me, too, that there was a connection, maybe not a direct connection, but undeniably a connection between the apocalyptic destruction of that war and the fate of Christianity in Europe. Well, we are, this year in November, it will be the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, the war to end all wars. It's a good time to think back on what that war did to religious liberty and religious practice throughout Europe and the Middle East, because I think it's a template for what all wars do. In his 2015 study of religion in the Great War, the scholar Philip Jenkins said that that war shows that the religious world as we know it at any time can be utterly transformed in a really short period of time. That's a central insight to our discussion this morning. The world of 1914, on the eve of war, saw European Christian powers, Germany, England, France, and so on, at their peak. As they all marched to war, the churches in those nations marched right along with them. They began to frame the coming war as a holy war. It really was that way in all these countries. There was no opposition to war. Everyone thought that they were conducting sort of a Christian jihad against the Hun. That was true on all sides. Benedict XV, the Pope, was a lonely anti-war voice. He said, "There is no limit to the measure of ruin and slaughter. Day by day, the earth is drenched with newly shed blood and is covered with the bodies of the wounded and the slain. Who would recognize brothers whose father is in heaven?" Perhaps because he was the head of a multinational organization, you might call the Roman Catholic Church, he did not have those nationalist loyalties that blinded him to the cost of the war. The conclusion of the war in 1918 had dramatic results for religious believers in every country that participated in the war. In Russia, the Holy Russia, as the Orthodox call it, the Russian Revolution overturned the monarchy and resulted in the near annihilation of the Orthodox Church. Every country into which the Bolshevik Revolution passed over the course of this century became a graveyard of Christianity. In Germany, whose Christian leaders had positioned Imperial Germany as sort of a messianic state, a state with a messianic mission, the defeat of the Germans, of the Kaiser, led to the rise of political extremism on the left and the right. Churches began to double down on nationalism and anti-Semitism. And more generally in Europe, thus began after the war the slow-motion collapse of all traditional forms of Christianity, something from which the churches there never recovered. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had been allied to Germany, led to the persecution of ancient Christian communities throughout the Middle East. And during the war, the Turks, fearing reasonably enough that European powers would use the presence of Christians under Ottoman rule as an excuse to colonize and dismember Turkey, cleansed their territories of Christians, leading to the genocide of 1.5 million Armenians, as well as the ethnic cleansing or religious cleansing of many other Christian communities there, including Assyrians and Chaldeans. The 1924 takeover of Turkey by Ataturk, which was another thing that the war caused, led to the suppression of Islam under secular nationalism, but it has now come roaring back. Muslims throughout the Middle East, responding to the defeat of the caliphate, found solace in political Islam, Islamism, which arose out of the ruins of World War I, and we have it very much with us today. So today, Christianity is nearly dead in Europe, though it's showing some signs of rebirth in Russia. Islam, in a modernist, politicized form that displaced traditional Islam, is strongly resurgent in the Middle East and Turkey, with grave implications for religious liberty there. What remained of the once strong Christian communities, indigenous Christian communities in the Middle East, are being further decimated today. And minority Islamic sects within countries in areas controlled by, say, the Sunni of ISIS, they're also being persecuted. The Iraq War, which was waged in part as a sort of holy war to bring enlightenment and liberal democracy to the region, has unleashed hell on the religious communities there. So, war is a terrible thing for religion. It debases the faith, and it can destroy the conditions under which faith can thrive. And yet, when nations prepare for war today, we so often have churches and religious leaders at the forefront blessing the conflict and urging it on as something to be encouraged in the service of God. It brings to mind a famous line from the Hebrew Bible, from Proverbs 26:11. As a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. Well, today we're going to hear from several experts on religious liberty and war. I have here on my left, at the end there, Heinrich Arnold. He's a pastor in a Bruderhof community in upstate New York, and a direct descendant of the Bruderhof movement's founder. The Bruderhof is an Anabaptist movement founded in 20th century Germany and sent into exile by Hitler. Next, we have Dr. Daniel Mark. Daniel is assistant professor of political science at Villanova and recently was chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And here on my right, we have Dr. Tom Farr. He's the president of the Religious Freedom Institute, a nonprofit that advances religious liberty worldwide. He taught religion and world affairs for many years at Georgetown and has been widely published in the field. So we're going to start by turning it over to you, Tom, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Rod. I often respond to that by saying I look forward to what I have to say as well. When I was asked to speak at this event, I thought, gosh, well, I've studied and written about religious freedom for many years, and as a historian thought about war for many years. But I'd never quite approached the issue in this way. What's the effect of war on religious freedom? And my initial impulse was precisely what Rod Dreher just said, and I think it is substantially true. War is a terrible thing for religion and for religious freedom, and he's given, as far as I'm concerned, the best case study for it, and that is the devastating impact of World War I on religious communities, on Islamic communities in the Middle East, Christianity in the Middle East. This began the decline of Christianity, which we're seeing today in the Middle East. I think George Weigel's phrase is the crisis of civilizational morale that came out of the First World War. It was a terrible thing for many, many things, including religion and religious freedom. But as I began to think about it, as usual, there are some complexities here that I think are interesting, and I would like to explore briefly with you in touching on 4 wars and maybe focusing on one of them. The Second World War, on its surface, seems to be precisely following the pattern of World War I. That is to say, it was a war against the Jews, a war against Judaism, an attempt to destroy Judaism, and indeed, as a totalitarian impulse, an attempt to destroy religion altogether. Not simply in Europe, but there's no doubt had Hitler and the Third Reich prevailed, all freedoms would have been destroyed, including religious freedom. So another way to think of the war, of course, is the Allied resistance to Hitler, which was the war to preserve these freedoms, including religious liberty. You may recall the 4 freedoms articulated by President Roosevelt as reasons for the United States getting into the war, in which he included religious freedom. So had we not won this war, you might call it a defensive war in this sense, our freedoms would have been destroyed. So let me call that a simple complexifying of this issue. I don't like that phrase, complexifying, but maybe it fits well here. Another war that seems to be quite straightforward in this respect is the so-called wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century in Europe. Following on the Reformation, the savaging of each other by Protestants and Catholics and of minority religions, not the least of whom were the Anabaptists, really by both sides. The reason I mention this is not to suggest that religious freedom came out of this, but to point out that many in the West believe religious freedom came out of these wars of religion. A standard narrative is that the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which ended this and the 30 Years' War, began national sovereignty, which is of course true, and the subordination of religion to the state, which to a certain extent is true. These Erastian states such as England and France, Protestant and Catholic respectively, subordinated the major religion. It was the religion of the king. And so goes the narrative today. This was the beginning of religious tolerance because it was the removal of religion from public life, based on the premise that if you don't do that, then religion will inevitably lead to conflict and war. I think this is a huge mistake, which leads me to my third war that I want to pause on for a minute, and that is the war for American independence, which I think laid the groundwork for the true understanding of religious freedom, which is not the privatization of religion, the removal of religion from public life, but the establishment of a state in which religion is welcomed, indeed urged into public life on the basis of full equality. Now, most people don't think of the American Revolution as a religion-oriented kind of war, but I think this is a mistake. If you've read about the American Revolution, of course you know about the opposition to taxes. Some things never change. Confiscatory taxation by the British Crown was debilitating in the 18th century, just as it's no longer the British Crown, but we still have the problem of taxation today. And this was a major, major cause of the war. But perhaps less emphasized, I want to emphasize here, is the powerful religious impulse behind many of the soldiers, the generals, the policies that were involved in resisting the British Crown, particularly among Protestant dissenting sects, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and the like. Now, of course, Americans at the time, just like they are now, were divided over that war. The Quakers and the descendants of the Anabaptists that were here at the time tended to a pacifist approach to the war. And then, of course, there was the Church of England itself, which was mainly in the South, which is where I'm from, in the Carolinas and Georgia. Many of those who supported the English crown were members of the Church of England in the South, but they were divided. It was this Protestant dissenting sect fervor, which was very much present in the armies, in the way that they prayed before battle. Read George Washington's recounting of the prayers that he prescribed before battle. Read the 2 volumes of Ellis Sandoz, I think it's entitled Political Sermons of the Founding Era, just full of this fervor, which I would characterize as kind of a Protestant individualist understanding of religion. This carried over, after the war was over, into the construction of our First Amendment. So in this sense, and please don't hear me as saying this was a war for religious freedom, it's more complicated than that, but this is an aspect of the American Revolution that I think is rarely emphasized, and I think it's important. This Protestant individualism, this sense that God, we must respond to him, that if we respond properly, he will be on our side, is of course the seedbed of some very problematic policies that are still with us today. But it is what it is, and indeed I think it was this fervor that led to the content of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now just one, and I'll go to my last war in just a second, but one very interesting aspect of this. This individualist fervor, which is much in our collective discussion these days, in part because of Patrick Deneen's work and the work of others, including Rod Dreher, although he doesn't really focus on this. But the notion that the American understanding of liberalism and freedom is intensely individualistic is not completely reflected in that First Amendment. And what I mean by that is, I think, encapsulated by the following. They considered a number of sets of words for that, what became the First Amendment. They debated this. And one candidate was, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or, I forget what the verb was, prohibiting or constricting the rights of conscience. Now, given what I've said about this Protestant individualism, that would have been the most logical way to characterize what they saw as the content of religion, the rights of conscience. We still say that. We believe it because it is constituent of religious freedom. But they did not put that in the First Amendment. They put the free exercise of religion. And my point is that this is not just about individuals, it's about groups as well. So I would argue that the American Revolution was necessary for that precious right that only in the United States has come to be associated with at least in my mind, and I hope in yours, with the right way to consider religious freedom. Not just an American invention, but an understanding of human nature and of the necessity of religious freedom for political prosperity, to quote George Washington in his second farewell address. Final point. It's a reverse of the first. Our wars, and I may be crossing over the past to the present here, I don't know, it depends on your meaning of the past, but the wars, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11, 2001, 2003, as Rod mentioned, they were expressly intended, or at least verbally, that was one of the, certainly the Afghanistan invasion. You remember the forward strategy of freedom of President Bush, the notion that we have to implant democracy, including religious freedom in these countries in order to drain the swamps of extremism. Well, I think it's not an overstatement to say it didn't work. And indeed, precisely the opposite has emerged, notwithstanding the fact that we managed to get religious freedom into the constitutions of both of those countries. They're there, read them, the constitutions of Afghanistan and Iraq. They protect religious freedom. There's some problems with that, which I won't go into, some wording problems. But the point is, we thought we were doing something that would undermine extremism, and it backfired. So I will leave you with the thought that, on balance, war, while sometimes it must be fought in defense of freedom and liberty, is a blunt and largely ineffective policy instrument for implanting the institutions and habits of freedom. There have to be cultural predicates, and if we're going to get into this, the jargon phrase for what we do in this is post-conflict stabilization. There are whole offices and departments of defense and state that focus on post-conflict stabilization. If you're going to do that, you have to engage the cultures, not simply the constitutional representatives and the officials of the state, and that is very hard work. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank the organizers, of course, for having me here, including me in this august panel. Mr. Dreher and I met earlier this year when I had the privilege of being a commenter on his book at a visit to Notre Dame. Dr. Farr, of course, I'm sure everybody in this room knows, is a legend in the international religious freedom world. And Pastor Arnold and I are first meeting, but my family loves the Bruderhof. And before this event was even a twinkle in George O'Neill's eye, we had a long-planned visit to their community for this coming August. So it's just really an exceptional honor to be with all of these people here this morning. By way of introduction, I mean, you've already heard who I am, but I should probably give a disclaimer. I'm off in two ways here. First, I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist. I do political theory. So political theory means not only am I not accountable to numbers like the mathematicians or the economists, I'm not even accountable to facts like the historians. We just make stuff up and then write it down. And second, I should say that I'm not a pacifist. I didn't give it too much investigation, but I don't even think there is a serious pacifist strain in the Jewish tradition. Maybe quietist, which is not to say I take all my political views from the Jewish tradition, but I'm sure there's a cultural factor there as well. And yet, while associating much more closely, for example, with the Catholic or natural law just war tradition, in my own views, I do think there is tremendous wisdom in Christian pacifism, and that it is a very important voice in the conversation. And I'll come back to that toward the end. As far as wars go, I guess I thought about this in terms of three types. My brain wants to organize things, so I thought about wars that are against religious freedom, maybe on both sides, wars that are for religious freedom, perhaps on one side at least, and wars that are kind of neither for nor against religious freedom, but affect religious freedom. And probably in some respect, maybe all wars are partly in that third category of at least affecting religious freedom, if not about them. And to be sure, those first two categories, I think there are very few wars that are fought first and foremost explicitly over religious freedom. But certainly there are wars, and we heard about this very astutely from Dr. Farr, that there are many wars that do have religious freedom directly implicated. The wars of religion, wars for, and so the outcome may have been an outcome that pointed toward religious freedom because of the Westphalian system, but it's also the case that neither side was particularly interested in, during the fighting of those wars, neither side, the Protestant nor the Catholic, was particularly interested in religious freedom. Victory meant being able to impose each side's own choices on whoever was defeated. Instead, they just split up in the end. But certainly we think about those wars as a contest for religious control. But I wanted to talk about something a little bit more contemporary and that I've seen a little bit more up close, not being centuries ago, but the Vietnam War, which I don't remember from my own lifetime, but something that I witnessed, the effects of which I witnessed when I visited Vietnam on a delegation with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Of course, as a result of the United States and its side not winning that war, communism took over not only the North but the South. And the severe religious repression in Vietnam continues today because we lost that war. And this affects religious freedom in seen and unseen ways. The seen ways, this is probably what you know about, what you'll read about in a USCIRF report or in the IRF report from the State Department, all the open restriction and repression of religion, which is quite open, and that goes everything from government regulation and a good communist bureaucratic faction to government thugs from the Ministry of Public Security beating up Hmong Christians in the Central Highlands, for example. So it's kind of a whole range of very overt oppression of religion. But there are also many unseen ways in which religion suffers under this kind of oppression. And we saw that, I think, most sadly and painfully. I mean, the saddest and the most painful were meeting victims who were physically harmed by the government for their beliefs, but in a more systematic way, the accommodation of religions to the repression. So our very depressing meeting with and I don't mean to malign him, but our very depressing meeting, for example, with the Catholic Archbishop in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, of course, where the church under his leadership, for reasons that are understandable and reasonable, but has entirely accommodated itself. There is no prophetic spirit. No priest is appointed or moved or anything without conferring with the government. No priest would be ordained unless it was someone the government found to be kosher, if I could mix metaphors here. And this was the Cao Dai. This is kind of a somewhat indigenous syncretic religion in Vietnam as well. We met there's an official, like with the Buddhists and so on, there's an official and an unofficial version. And we met the cardinal who heads the official religion, and it was someone, I mean, it was the worst kind of, someone who was a very old man. It's someone who had seemed like he had the spirit of someone who spent 80 years as a government bureaucrat, being kind of a government mouthpiece. No energy, no excitement, no faith. I even tried to personalize it, asked him, how did you get into the religion? And he said, oh, well, my parents raised me in this faith. And then he just kind of like moved up the ladder unthinkingly his whole life until he was the government-appointed agent to run this massive faith in Vietnam. And all of this, with more time, I could be more colorful, but all of this is because we lost a war that allowed a regime that is anti-liberty and certainly anti-religious liberty to dominate there. Which is not to say we necessarily should have been fighting that war in the first place. That's a separate debate, of course, but as far as the consequences of the war. There are also very immediate ways that are parallel to this in which we can see the effect of war on religious freedom. Iraq is on everyone's mind, and we've heard about it a little. Many of us probably remember, because it wasn't that long ago, that ISIS, in its quest to exterminate the Yazidis, just to pick one group of many, had laid siege to Mount Sinjar, where they had taken refuge, and the world was faced with the choice to bomb ISIS and relieve the siege and save the lives of the Yazidis, or to let them die. And the U.S. and some of its allies perhaps did bomb ISIS and did save the lives of some Yazidis. And that was just now, again, the ISIS has quite explicitly waged war against religious freedom. I don't say that's the only motivation, but certainly it's a very explicit part of the motivation. And the Yazidis were being persecuted precisely because they were of the wrong faith. And we were faced with a very stark choice, a choice we have not made in every case historically, to either use military force and save their lives or not. There are many other people, of course, who have been in mortal danger around the world whose lives have not been saved by military force when we had that option. And that doesn't mean it was a mistake in every case, but certainly it's not simple to say that it would have been better to let the Yazidis die of starvation and thirst on Mount Sinjar as they were besieged by ISIS. So let me move on to keep this as brief as I can to wars that are not about religious freedom, but do affect religious freedom. And for there, I want to talk about the two aspects: in war, what I'll call conditions of war, and then after war, the emanations of war. So as far as in war and the conditions of war, well, Syria is a good example here. In the history, this is a current conflict I'm sure we'll hear about, but even looking about since this has been going on at least since 2011, there's plenty of history for us to discuss as well. In Syria, we have seen the massive destruction of not only religious communities, but religious heritage. And it's a religious heritage that's unlikely to ever be recovered, not only because ancient churches can't be rebuilt and still remain the same ancient churches, but because in many cases, these communities will never be restored to their ancestral homelands, no matter how much goodwill there is in the international community for that. A similar thing, of course, has happened in Iraq. And I think that this is probably true in Syria and to some extent in Iraq, even without ISIS, which is to say, even if this war was really just between the regime and its opposition and not ISIS and the other foreign fighters, I think we can probably see that this is a war that would have in any case had catastrophic effects on religious practice and religious communities in Syria. The Assad regime, in its attempt to divide and conquer, pretty literally, attacks religion as a way to oppress and suppress. This is true both in peacetime and in wartime there. And this doesn't prove that we should have intervened in Syria. I mean, that someone, as I consider myself someone who's is a strong critic of President Obama. And it's not to say that I think that President Obama made all the right decisions on Syria, but something I think that does need to be said is there were very few good answers for that situation when the president faced it. Which is not to say that all the best choices were made, but just to say that there's no. I want to be clear that there was no simple solution. There is no simple solution for that conflict. And it's not to say that more war would have meant less destruction of religion, but certainly that war has taken its incredible toll there. A similar example, it doesn't seem similar perhaps intuitively, but is what I've seen in Nigeria as well. And this is an ongoing crisis that's probably escalating. In the middle belt of Nigeria, people in Washington, D.C. tend to know about this a little more than the general population, but in Nigeria, there's a conflict between the Fulani herdsmen, Muslim cattle herders in the middle belt, and Christian farmers. And it's a long story. There's kind of two views in the DC policy establishment. The dominant view that's kind of a 50-50 conflict, and then the probably minority view, though being held, I think, by more and more people now that it's a campaign of the Muslims against the Christians there. But what's clear there is that conflict has a lot of economic motivations because of the contest over land between farmers and herdsmen. But it's obvious that this conflict is severely inflamed by the fact that it falls along religious lines. And there's absolutely no doubt that tensions between communities, between religious communities, are far heightened from beyond what they would be when the violence falls along religious lines. You have, separate from the Middle Belt conflict, you have many Christians in villages in the north that have been attacked by Boko Haram that no longer trust their non-Boko Haram Muslim neighbors because they view it as though the Muslim neighbors collaborated with Boko Haram when they came in to attack the Christians and some Muslims, even though it may have been just behavior that was instigated by a desire to save their own lives. So all of that is just, again, a very quick adumbration of how war can be not about religious freedom, but inevitably, and we could probably go on with every example of every war, about how war can deeply affect religious freedom in the conflict itself. But then there's after the war, what I call the emanations of war. And this goes quite closely to what Mr. Dreher had started off with, speaking about the way in which societies are transformed when they fight wars. And it's important to note that societies are transformed when they fight wars, even when that war is largely not fought on their own territory. We can think of England, France as well in World War I, thinking about the United States in World War II, World War I as well in some respect, but it's probably more vivid in American history, thinking about, for example, the way the entry of women into the workforce in World War II was a catalyst for massive social changes, for good, not to say all for ill, right? Some of these changes, depending on which example you pick, can be for good or they can be for ill. But I think what's undeniable, like Mr. Dreher said, is that war, both where it takes place and in the societies that fight it, where it does not take place, is an incredible disruptor of traditions, structures, and hierarchies. And again, that's true both for good and for ill. And therefore, even when war is good, and not everyone here, of course, will think that war can be good sometimes, but even when war is good, ultimately war will always be partly bad, we should be wary, or at least mindful, of the societal upheavals that follow. Because there may be indeed, and the example from France was very illustrative, there may be indeed great cost to traditional religious forms and orders. And I think World War I certainly gives us a great example of that. And so the lessons for us, and especially for policymakers, I think are first that war itself, like any tool, is not good or bad. War is good or bad depending on who wields the power. Now, war will always involve bad things. I don't deny that. We certainly make a lot of mistakes, but when power is wielded by the right side, then it can be good. And unfortunately, I think we are reaping today in the world the consequences of some number of years of a retreat of American power from the world. Second, war can be an important tool for international religious freedom. Rwanda, which was not a religious conflict, where we didn't intervene, we can contrast that with the Rohingya, not that we have intervened militarily there, but an example where someone told at dinner last night the story of Rohingya Muslim children in Burma being thrown into the fires of their villages that were being burned down. Speaking for myself only, I will say that I would not have been sorry if someone with a gun had stopped that. Now, none of this addresses whether it's in our country's interest or any other particular's interest to go to war for the sake of international religious freedom in a particular case. But it does mean that that is an option that should be on the table. Power, of course, can be abused and corrupted, but I, as a non-pacifist, don't think that this is an argument against power. It is an argument for oversight and for separation of powers, for checks and balances. So even though I may not agree with the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy on every detail, I certainly think that, as was mentioned in our MC's gracious opening, that is an important area for collaboration on all sides to make sure that if power is wielded, that it is wielded well with all the appropriate oversight and checks. And of course, to keep in mind that not only can power be abused and corrupted, but even when power is used well, there are side effects, and what I'll call in quotes, side effects, and necessarily so. And we need to accept those consequences when we make our decisions. We need to recognize that there are unintended consequences, which is to say the ones we don't intend but can foresee, the great devastation that occurs necessarily when violence is used, and the unanticipated consequences, which are different from the unintended ones, because though we also don't intend them, we also can't foresee them. And that includes a lot of the societal upheavals, which are impossible to predict. And fortunately, the pacifist voice, Christian or otherwise, can alert us to these dangers, and therefore it's so important as one impetus toward restraint. And so I, for one, would still fight World War II. I, for one, would still vote for fighting ISIS, but power must still be wielded wisely, prudently, and judiciously. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you, Rod and Tom and Danielle, and thanks to the Committee for Foreign Responsibility for inviting me this morning to speak on behalf of the Bruderhof communities. Rod, you got one thing wrong. I'm not an expert really on anything, definitely not on foreign policy or history, but I am a pastor, so forgive me if anything I say today sounds like a sermon. It might be. So it's an honor for me to speak on behalf of the Bruderhof communities. We're an intentional Christian community church, very small church, about 3,000 members worldwide, living in 23 different locations on 4 continents. We try to follow the example of the early Christian church, living in community, sharing our lives, livelihood, and everything in common. Well, not our wives or our personality. So today's question is, how does war impact people's freedom, particularly the freedom to live and practice faith? Faith instructs our moral conscience. And so when believers stand up to what is wrong, if that wrong is being perpetrated by a state, especially a state at war, then persecution is inevitable. When thinking about the impact of war, the first question that comes to mind is, what is war? Because there are many kinds of war. You know, the war on hunger, the war on drugs, on racism, on violence, on the genocide of abortion, or the fight to uphold family and marriage, biblical values, the fight to protect freedom and religion. People of faith should be on the fronts of these wars, as special forces, really fighting these wars right on the front. The Apostle Paul instructed us to put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. That was the sermon part, Ephesians 6:11. So what brings us together today, I think, is a shared concern and dislike of the wars that are brought on by nationalism and cultural, religious, and political disputes that are egged on by greed and hatred. History is made up of these wars. We heard eloquently from the other speakers already about some of these wars, and they don't show any sign of stopping. Plato rightly said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." These wars cause death, destruction, and suffering without respect of guilt or innocence. They are built on lies. Indeed, the Greek philosopher Aeschylus said, "In war, truth is the first casualty." We hate such war. So how do we stop wars? When diplomacy fails, states turn to force. But the church has to find another way. Jesus showed us that way, love. Since it is impossible to legislate love, we need to wage war on the causes of war, one person, one heart at a time, starting with ourselves. It's human nature to strike back, to seek revenge when we are wronged. But Jesus taught us to love your enemy and do good to those who hate you. Matthew 5:43. That is why my church is a peace church, and why I am a conscientious objector to participation in war, even though I greatly respect the brave men and women who serve in the military, and also respect the point of view that Daniel pointed out about just war. This belief, particularly in time of war, historically has led to limitations of freedom to live out our faith in Christian community. Now, personally, I haven't experienced this because I've been blessed to live in this wonderful country for about half a century where there's been relative domestic peace and security. But for my forebears, it wasn't always the case, so I'd like to tell that story. The Bruderhof was founded by my great-grandparents. Their names were Eberhard and Emmy Arnold in Germany. And as Rod pointed out, that was in the aftermath of World War I, and that really was the formative thing that drew them to this radical way of life community. He was a PhD in philosophy and theology and was a popular speaker and writer. When World War I broke out, he was called to the front, and he served as a driver in the German army for about 2 weeks. Then he was dismissed due to poor health. But he still wished to serve the cause of the fatherland. Like Rod pointed out, it was a holy war, and everybody was behind it. So he volunteered in the military hospitals. And what he heard there and saw there just struck his heart. So many stories of despair and these young boys coming back wounded, and the stories from the trench warfare. And this drove him to change his point of view. And he felt, following that experience, that a follower of Jesus cannot, in good conscience, participate in war. So this eventually, among other things, led to him starting a church community as an alternative to the causes of war: capitalism, militarism, and power politics. He, as was mentioned, he identified with the Anabaptists of the 16th century, and basic to the Anabaptist worldview is a doctrine that there are two kingdoms of the world, in which order is maintained by either the use of violence or the kingdom of Christ, which is characterized by peace and forgiveness. So anyways, starting his community in the 20s, Adolf Hitler came to power, actually early in the 1930s, 1933. My great-grandfather began speaking out against the dangers of the policies that he was seeing. He was very aware of this. And he worked alongside others that we recognize, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, and Karl Barth, who was a personal friend. But rather than respond with violence, he believed that he was called to testify to the gospel of Christ, even to the Nazis. One of the things he said back then was, "Our calling is to represent the kingdom of God and the church of Jesus Christ with all consequences. This also means opposition to the state, which has to be maintained by violence and the military. We do not withhold our respect from God-ordained government, but our calling, however, is different." So the first effect of this of persecution, because of this point of view, was the dissolution of the Bruderhof's private school, because they refused to teach Nazi propaganda and theory on race. So all the school-aged children had to secretly be sent across the border to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and a small Bruderhof community was started in Liechtenstein. Next, economic persecution ramped up as the Nazi regime restricted and confiscated livelihood and resources of the community. On November 9th, 1933, 3 days before all Germans were commanded to sign a vote of confidence, Eberhard Arnold wrote a letter to Adolf Hitler. Now, this is interesting. Following Jesus' command to love your enemy, he started that letter as "to our beloved Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler." Not many people called him by that term. And he had this letter hand-delivered. And in this letter, he audaciously asked that the Bruderhof be allowed to remain in Germany, to work and serve their neighbors and country with love and dedication, but at the same time he made it clear that they would refuse to participate in the military service, and they would refuse to become part of the Nazi party and would not go along with the mandatory Heil Hitler greeting. He ended the letter with this sentence: "We ask God from our hearts that at God's hour, our beloved Reich Chancellor may become, instead of a historical instrument of supreme state authority, an ambassador of the humiliated Christ." Smack. Well, about a week after this letter was delivered, the Bruderhof was, guess why, big surprise, stormed by about 150 SS and Gestapo troops. And all the residents were interrogated, the place was ransacked and searched for weapons. But by the grace of God, they were not shot or shipped off to concentration camp, but allowed to remain in Germany for another 3 years, until April 1937, when the Gestapo returned to forcibly dissolve the Bruderhof and confiscated all their property. They arrested 3 of the leaders, and they gave 24 hours for the remainder to flee the country. Prior to that, actually, in 1935, my great-grandfather died in a Nazi hospital, some think suspiciously, from sepsis after surgery for a broken leg. And a day before he died, he shouted loudly in feverish delirium, "Has Goebbels yet repented?" So I wonder if that had anything to do with his death, but only God knows. So my grandfather, Johann Heinrich, share his name, and other young men from the Bruderhof were forced to flee the country because they refused to serve in the German army. This was dangerous because evading military service meant prison or death. So he traveled with my grandmother the day after their wedding, and at the border, he didn't have a up-to-date passport, but my grandmother managed to sweet-talk the officials into giving a visa to go to England for their honeymoon. Many other stories like that. Miraculously, the whole community, all the members were able to flee Germany, and it ended up regrouping in England. And this is where my father, Johann Christoph, was born. So now you have this group of German pacifists, Anabaptists in England, and they were looked at with growing suspicion during the height of the war. In fact, one humorous episode, local authorities came to the community to investigate a tip from a neighbor that they were secretly building German U-boats in a quarry pool on the property. So they searched that and they found a lot of mud and gravel. Despite sympathy from the government and the Home Office, they eventually were forced to emigrate to Paraguay and South America, the only country that would receive them. So that's where my parents grew up. Now, following World War II, in this country, there was a grassroots movement for peace and cooperative living. And many people turned to the Bruderhof for inspiration. And the Bruderhof was down in Paraguay. So many of those had been conscientious objectors during World War II. So for this reason, for this interest, and also because the economy in Paraguay wasn't very good, the community started a little church community up in New York State, Woodcrest Community, in 1954. Now, Woodcrest was inundated with visitors at that time. There's some interesting stories. Eleanor Roosevelt dropped in for a few hours and stayed for a lunch of lamb stew. Dorothy Day came up from New York Catholic Worker. Many people joined the community, professionals and laborers, rich, poor, religious people from the Brethren Church, Quaker Church, and atheists. They were all attracted by a way of life that could answer the problems they experienced, an antidote to war. During the Vietnam War, at the time of the military draft, all the young Bruderhof men applied for conscientious objector status. With the generous help of General Hershey, the director of the Selective Service Agency, our church was able to set up an alternative service program in schools and publishing houses and other places like that. My father did his alternative service at a publishing house, The Plow. In his later years, my father, who had been profoundly influenced by Dr. Martin Luther King, meeting him in the civil rights movement of the 60s, he ended up serving as elder of our church. And he wrote and spoke frequently on topics of forgiveness, peace, and reconciliation, and traveled widely to different parts of the world that were in conflict. I'd like to conclude my remarks with a quote from him that he said at a speech in Milan at a peace conference in 2004. He said, "But enough about war. I would rather address the ways in which each of us can break the cycle of violence and build a more peaceful world. In any conflict you name, you will find people on both sides who are working hard to end the violence with a weapon that is as old as humankind, but must always be discovered anew. It is the weapon of forgiveness. Let us pray for all the wounded in the new wars that are tearing our world apart, and not only for the innocent, but also for those with evil intentions, for the victims of war and for its profiteers, for the soldiers and the civilians, the cheerleaders and the dissenters. Let us pray for our presidents and prime ministers, but also for the mothers of the dead and for those lying in bombed-out hospitals, but also for those in military hospitals. Let us pray that all of these may find peace, because, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, the judgment of God is upon our world, and unless we learn to live together as brothers and sisters, we will perish together as fools." So today, the Bruderhof communities continue to live an alternative to war, to militarism, and private property. And we are very grateful that our country has granted us the freedom to live according to our beliefs. Today, we pray that the values and liberties on which our nation was founded will continue to be protected and strengthened. Yes, there will be wars and rumors of wars as long as power and mammon drives our world, but we can live by kingdom of God politics, Jesus Christ's way that can turn the world upside down. It will be war, but for the sake of life, let's gather our armies and wage that war on hatred, selfishness, oppression, and on the final enemy, death. But let's choose our weapons carefully and wield the sword of prayer and redemptive love. Thank you.
Thank you. In the time we have left, I have a couple of questions for the panelists. It seems to me that liberty, or liberalism, and liberal democracy, and religious liberty in particular, in Europe is going to be a casualty, and is now a casualty of the United States decision to bring liberal democracy to Iraq. If we say that the war in Syria, if it comes directly from what we did in Iraq, the migration of so many war refugees into Europe is also a fruit of that war. We're starting to see now in Europe an illiberalism rising. We all know that liberalism has been questioned in a general way by the times in which we live, but in particular in Europe, you're seeing the rise of nationalist politicians who are quite concerned about whether or not Europe is going to be able to absorb a lot of Muslim refugees, and what that is going to mean for the future of liberty itself in Europe. What I'd like to know is your thoughts on whether or not religious liberty can be sustained in Europe when there is such a clash of civilizations with so many Muslim refugees clashing or butting up against an increasingly nationalist European population.
I take it that's for me.
And Danielle, too.
And Danielle as well. Danielle, wouldn't you like to answer that first?
Go ahead.
Of course, it's a major challenge, the influx of refugees, most of whom are Muslim, and some of whom are mounting a severe challenge to the, if you like, the identity of countries like France and Germany, other Western European countries. There's no question that this is deeply disruptive. One can question, and I certainly do, the wisdom of the immigration policies that just simply open the doors without discernment of what the impact would be. So I do accept the proposition, which I think is, you actually said it, and it's the premise of your question, that this is disruptive. But I would also say that I think the status of religious liberty in Europe has long been weak and impoverished, and particularly the understanding of religious liberty as something that involves public religious expression and the public involvement of religious individuals and groups in the lives of nations and societies, including in the development of public policy and laws. I think this is, in this sense, the French understanding of religious freedom, laïcité, which is a subordination of religion, a privatization of religion, a removal of it from public life. It's not just about the wearing of the burqa or the hijab or the cross. That's the sort of the public face of the issue. But laïcité, really for 2 centuries, although it's emerged in the 20th century, in France has meant the privatization of religion. So I think that this understanding has dominated European culture and politics for decades and has weakened their capacity to deal with the immigration of any kind of religious community, especially Islam. In my view, one of the reasons that, of course, we have not had, I will admit, we have not had what Europe has faced in the last few years, but we've had Muslims in the United States for a couple of hundred years and an influx of Muslims, and we have not seen, by and large, the kind of radicalism or political Islamism that you had referred to earlier, Rod, in the United States. And I think one reason for that, there are many, opportunity, economic opportunity and so forth. One reason is religious liberty. I view it as a sort of a counter-extremism weapon, if you can put it that way, that Europe lacks and has lacked for a long time, and that is to say the integration of all religious groups. The whole history of America has been the absorption of ethnic and national and religious groups, including Catholics. So Europe is particularly weakened, and I think in addition to this unwise influx, particularly in Germany, is a weakened condition, in part because of World War I, but also in part because of a very thin and impoverished understanding of what religious liberty is. And I think that's true of all the countries of Europe, including the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you. It's a tough question, certainly, which is why it's a good question. In the context outside of this line of work that I do sometimes speak about religious freedom in the U.S. and in the West more generally. And often my opening line is that my work in international religious freedom certainly makes the problems we face in the West pale in comparison to what we see in some of the places we've described today and other places as well. But the lesson that I always say we need to take from that is not that we shouldn't be concerned about religious freedom in the West, but we should be even more sensitive to how precious that inheritance is and how fragile it is, and in fact, how vigilant we need to be to defend it, because we cannot and should not take for granted the culture that's necessary to sustain what we have in terms of liberty in general and religious liberty in particular. I mean, if there's something I think that when people like the American conservative folks, and I don't want to name anyone in particular because I don't have quotes for it, but when people of that set oppose the Iraq War, I think one of the strongest points of argument there, and this wasn't just reflexive, well, we hate George Bush, so anything he does is wrong, that you might have gotten from opponents on the left, but this was a real a good faith disagreement by people who said you can't just liberate people from tyranny, from political oppression, and expect that the conditions for republicanism, small r, for liberty will be present and will allow a normal liberal system, again, classical liberal system, to flourish. That the West has 2,000 plus years of cultural baggage in the good sense that makes our life possible, and that was a good point, and it certainly proved to be correct. And so the lesson for us is that culture really matters. And so Europe is in a tough situation of trying to balance, on one hand, the mercy and sympathy and aid that we probably all owe as human beings to refugees, and the need to defend the kind of culture that will make Western-style liberalism continually possible and sustainable. And of course, now you see a backlash. Not all the backlash has good motivations, but you see a backlash in European nationalism by some who want to ensure that culture is preserved. And that's not just xenophobia. There may be xenophobic people, certainly, but it's not just xenophobia. It's people who recognize that it's important. The United States is also seeing massive cultural changes as a result of immigration. They may be good, they may be bad, but it's really there. And so we need to focus on how vulnerable culture is and think of a way. Now, I don't have a solution to this problem, but it's a real tension. It's not just good guys versus bad guys, because there's, of course, a need to aid the world, and then also a need to preserve the kind of culture that makes liberty possible.
We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask everyone on the panel, if you were advising political leaders, as religious believers yourself, if you were advising political leaders marching up to the next war to consider the religious freedom angle of going to war, now, what would you say to them to add to their discernment? Now, I know it's hard to do that without having particulars like what we're going to war about, but as a general matter, given the things we've said today about the unintended consequences of war on religious practice and religious liberty, are there any general principles that you would say ought to be part of future debates?
They're all looking at me. I would say, the concept of respect for life. I would plead with political leaders to respect any point of view and any belief, and reverence for life, and keep it as simple as that, because there's a role for government, for policy, for politics, and as a person of faith, I believe that our call should be the conscience of the country, that love everybody, but still respect the need for each country to govern itself and to protect its interests.
I can also be very brief, just following on my own remarks as well, to think about it, as you say, it's an impossible question without the context, but to think about, which we did not in Iraq, of course, but what will it look like on the ground after the war? What will the conditions for religious liberty be when the fighting is done and then a people is left there to try to rebuild? And second, what will be irreparably lost if we do or don't, or irretrievably lost if we do or don't fight? What lives, of course, what else can't be rebuilt after the war?
I would say don't go to war unless vital American interests are at stake, but I can envision a case in which the existence of terrorism, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or ISIS, can threaten vital American interests, including the homeland, and that this is the scenario that was laid out in the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. But if you're going to do this, you must not assume that simply toppling the dictator is going to allow the springing up of a stable democracy. It was foolhardy. We didn't do the work. It's hard work. It may, in fact, be necessary in the future. I fear that Iraq is on the road to becoming a majoritarian Muslim tyranny in which Shia and Sunni simply go at each other without any kind of infrastructure, political, social, cultural, or otherwise. All of the non-Muslim minorities are going to disappear from Iraq. And if that happens, it becomes once again simply a training ground for the kind of terrorism that can impact us. And so, to me, that is a national security issue. But it's much harder than simply defeating an army and declaring victory.
Yeah, I'd like to conclude by reflecting on the unintended consequences, the tragedy of war, by talking very briefly about a country I care about a lot, the Netherlands. Prior to the Second World War, the Netherlands was one of the most religious countries in the world. Lots of Catholics there, lots of Protestants, of course. Then came the Nazi occupation and the experience of the Second World War. There's not a Dutchman alive who would say that that war shouldn't have been fought to free their own country from Nazi tyranny. But after the war was concluded and the Nazis had been defeated, the religious organizations in the country, not only the churches, but also civic organizations based around religion, they came back together to try to reconstitute what had been there before. But their hearts weren't in it. And so when the first winds of the counterculture began to blow in the 1960s, it all collapsed. Today, the Netherlands is a wonderful place, but it's also a very atheistic country, a very secular country, a country where very few people go to church at all. So that was a war that had to be fought, but we now see it led, the trauma of that war and the Nazi occupation led to the evaporation of religion in the Netherlands, and what started out the 20th century as one of the most religious countries in Europe. Religious liberty doesn't matter if there is no religion to practice or nobody in a society or a country to practice that religion. This, I think, is something we should keep in mind before we're quick to go to war, even necessary wars, that they do have these consequences that we may not be able to foresee, but we ought to keep that in mind because we have examples all around us within living memory of this sort of thing happening. I want to thank all the panel here. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, George, for having us.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to do a quick introduction for Ambassador Brownback. Ambassador Sam Brownback was sworn in as Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom on February 1st, 2018. He served as Governor of Kansas from 2011 to 2018, and previously he served as a U.S. Senator from 1996 to 2011, and a U.S. representative in the House of Representatives from 1995 and 1996, representing the great state of Kansas. While a member of the Senate, he worked actively on the issue of religious freedom in multiple countries and was a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. He also served as Kansas Secretary of Agriculture and was a White House Fellow in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in the early 90s. Prior to his public service, Ambassador Brownback was a private attorney in Kansas. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Sam Brownback.
How are you? Good to see you. Well, good morning, everybody. If you're like me, you're kind of, I'm just going, We've had a big week, and it's been a great week. We had over 80 countries that came to the ministerial, a high number of foreign ministers that were out. I haven't looked at the final numbers on that. Good support for the 6 statements that we did. 3, one on China, one on Burma, one on Iran, others on blasphemy laws and counterterrorism issues that a number of countries signed on to. We've had 4 countries, I would say actually push it and say 5, that agreed to host and announced they would host regional religious freedom events in their part of the world, which is something we're pushing aggressively. The Secretary announced public-private partnership program, bold line to accelerate the partnerships, public-private, on religious freedom. Announced a fund that was being put forward, one being public, one being private fund to help recovery of people in genocide areas, and then also against and for religious freedom. The Vice President spoke, Jared Kushner spoke, the Secretary spoke, the AID Administrator spoke, the UN Ambassador spoke, Nikki Haley. We had Deputy Secretaries there. We really had everybody in on the topic of religious freedom. So I'm going to tell the staff today, no vacation next week. We want to harvest all those commitments next week, and the week after that you can go on vacation, because there's been a number of commitments that we want to grab a hold of and make these things move on forward. This is the first time this has ever been done, and I think we hit a vein because it's just really it's been very good commitments here and a lot of strength of support in other places. I think it's an issue that governments for a long time have just not known how to deal with. Okay, we don't want to deal with religion. We want it to go away. It will go away. It hasn't gone away. Now what do we do? It's a source of all these problems, but it can be a source of all these goods. What do I do here? We're pitching them, say, look, there's a very simple answer on this. It's religious freedom. So you let everybody be free. You don't pick a winner or loser in any of it. And then you really encourage it. And if people are out there committing crimes, if they are doing violent act, if they're promoting terrorism, you go arrest them. That's not right, but otherwise you let them practice their faith and you encourage it. Faith's a good thing. So we're hopeful moving this on forward. The civil society component of this is critical. The faith piece of this is critical. The media piece of this is critical. So I want to keep urging you, now that we've gotten a launch and we're launching an alliance, both governments and private sector and media with this, that let's drive it on forward. Let's do one of these in Indonesia. Let's have a big ministerial meeting in Indonesia or Bahrain or Denmark or Argentina. And let's have civil society groups go and be a part of that and say, okay, we want to network with you in South America and Central America on these issues. We want to network with you in Southeast Asia on these issues. We want to provide academic support for you for this good cause. We want to continue to supply and move this on forward. So it's like we busted through the gate, busted the barrier down, but now you got to keep running. You need to move this on forward. I really do feel like we're at a moment where the Iron Curtain comes down on religious freedom and there's a burst of freedom that comes forward. How you sort through that for individuals, How you sort through that for countries is going to be critically important because each country is going to be somewhat different. And they're going to have different issues that they're interested in, but at the end of the day, we keep pushing. It's about freedom, it's freedom, it's freedom. The government's role is to protect the right to religious freedom. You protect the right to religious freedom. You don't pick a winner or a loser, you just protect the right. You protect your people. You make sure they're free. And then you just keep pushing on a clear and simple message. I still want to get the Abrahamic faiths together, the faith leaders together, asked to come together by the governments in Israel, the Vatican, and Saudi Arabia around the issue of religious freedom, and that our faith does not support the use of violence in the promotion of the faith. Just around a simple one statement. No violence in the promotion of the faith. And to have Abrahamic faith leaders come together around that piece, that issue. I'd love to get equal citizenship in there as well. I don't know, Tom, I may be getting greedy to try to go that far, but just no violence would be a big move forward. So these are things that we're going to press on from here. We hope you keep coming. Some of you come to the round table on a regular basis on Tuesday, 11 to noon. It's usually here on the Hill, sometimes different places. Hope you can keep doing that because there'll be a lot of different action points. I really appreciate the Commission's work that they continue to do. They have done great work. Several of our particularly European allies are interested in this women's issues, intersection with religious freedom or supporting women's rights with religious freedom. And I said, you guys have already done a study on that. They're very pleased about that. Good. That's the area you want to work in? Great. We want to work too there. So there'll be plenty of different venues for this to take. We just got to keep driving it. This administration is on board. Well, now you're going to need to work the administration. What does it look like for AID to prioritize religious freedom in their grant programs in Uzbekistan? What's that look like? We've got a lot of money that we put into Uzbekistan and other places. So what's it look like if we tried to emphasize religious freedom? We need more security people buying into the notion of religious freedom being a baseline piece of it. Well, what's that look like? How do we get that into the Department of Defense and National Security Council people about making this an emphasis point? And how do we continue to draw it within the foreign policy establishment too? Plenty to do. Don't take next week off. Take the week after that off. And then let's get back to leaning into it, keeping at the plow. God bless you all. Thanks, guys. Okay. Good to see you. Take care. Oh, did you? Yeah. So you're out from Hayes, huh?
That's where I grew up. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for all that you do and all of the projects and efforts that you oversee. Now let's get on with our second panel. I'd like to introduce to you our moderator today. Dr. Peter Petkoff is a senior law lecturer at the Brunel Law School. He is also director of the Religion, Law, and International Relations Program, a collaborative international research network at Regent's Park College, Oxford, and serves as managing editor of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. He is a legal consultant for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Freedom of Religion of Belief at the House of Lords. Peter is involved in cutting-edge research on the relationship between religion and politics and law and religion. In his capacity as director of the Religion, Law, and International Relations Program at Regent's Park College, Oxford. He brings together lawyers, theologians, philosophers, social and political scientists, and aims to develop innovative interdisciplinary strategies for studying law, religion, and international relations from legal and theological perspectives. He is currently writing a book for Oxford University Press on holy sites under international law. At Brunel University, he is a member of the Interdisciplinary Center for Security and Intelligence Studies. And please welcome Dr. Peter Petkoff.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I would like to thank the Bruderhof, our hosts, for inviting me for this session. And I'm humbled, but also honored to moderate this stellar panel. Of course, the topic is somehow challenging. The impact of current wars on religious freedom. What do men and women of faith have to do with stopping wars? And what kind of wars are we talking about? Certainly, the religious freedom dimension does emerge in one of my in more than one context, in more than one types of wars. Religious freedom appears to be in the center of debating conventional as well as cultural wars, from cultural wars to war on terror and multilateral military hostilities. In terms of looking at the way religious freedom makes a difference in ending wars, I propose that we look into a particular image, which is in the Cathedral of Ghent, The Adoration of the Lamb by the Van Eyck brothers. This fresco has a very perplexing image of the just judges and the milites Christi, the militants of Christ, depicted together in the same corner of the altarpiece, which baffles many theologians and men of faith why and in what sense the militants are just judges in the same way the civil just judges are. And this brings us to a very long tradition of thinking of just war, or in what sense war is just, at least in the Christian context, in the Christian tradition. Of course, for those of us who have been brought up with scriptural evangelical tradition, peace is the ontological positioning of humanity. It is the direction of history, and it's in some way a precept we have to follow. But ultimately, and for the purposes of this conversation, peace is not something per se, something with which we achieve just for the sake of peace. It is a praxis which involves winning peace out of opposition. Or as the political theologian Oliver O'Donovan says, peace in some way is linked very closely and very importantly with a service, with the worship of reconciliation. And without this worship of reconciliation, you cannot have a peace per se. Without the service of reconciliation, you cannot have the tranquility of order. So, in this very context, religious freedom becomes very important because any end of war, any end of hostilities, any intelligent and coherent positioning in relation to culture as well as conventional war is this preparedness to achieve this service of reconciliation. And without this service of reconciliation, there cannot be, obviously, a true peace. And religious freedom plays a very central part in shaping societies during and post-war, which are vibrant enough, dynamic enough, fluid enough to maintain and facilitate coexistence of multiple moral paradigms, multiple understandings of social perfectionism, which allows this service of reconciliation to be achieved. And without this, very often, the end of hostilities do not really achieve this shaping of political or social perfectionism, which the end of hostilities and peace is supposed to achieve. So religion today, more than ever before, shapes public policy. It is used to redesign geopolitics by shifting our perceptions from states protecting human beings and human rights to states protecting each other, protecting themselves from one another and protecting their sovereignty. And religion is increasingly being used as creating these new Kulturkampfs and new geopolitics which shift and reshape the directions of foreign policy and international law. And in this process, religious freedom is often the first victim, because religion becomes more of a common denominator of shaping the Kulturkampf rather than of protecting the vibrant and dynamic and diverse communities. So our perceptions, our metrics in understanding conflicts and how those conflicts reshape the political status quo is increasingly important, and religion, as well as freedom of religion and belief, become a very important aspect in these dynamics. Another aspect is that since the end of the Cold War, political theorists and foreign relations specialists have focused increasingly on game theories rather than ideologies. And again, this has shifted away the balance from looking into the way ideologies shape the social demographics, the social dynamics, and we are increasingly losing the plot in terms of how religion as a form of ideology shape those dynamics. Without saying more on that, I would now turn the conversation to our stellar panel. We have people who have engaged with those questions and through their work, through their writings, as well as through a very specific engagement in the field of humanitarian relief, public policy, and media. Cristina Arriaga is no stranger for any of us. She's the co-chair of the International Commission for International Religious Freedom. She's a lawyer and a theologian. She has done great work for many years in the field of religious freedom advocacy, and now she's at the forefront of looking into the relationship between religious freedom and public policy. In addition to that, we have Steve Gemmer, who is doing a great work in terms of humanitarian relief in very difficult parts of the world, from Myanmar to Syria. Last but not least, we have with us John Allen, who is an editor of Crux. He's a very visible commentator of Vatican affairs, and as his CV tells us, that when he is to interview or to engage with the high echelons of the Holy See, he does not need any introduction, and he's no stranger there. So, without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Cristina Arriaga, to share her reflections with us.
Thank you, Dr. Petkoff. It's so nice to have someone with such a great accent all the way from Oxford coming to moderate our panel.
You make me blush again.
Yes. I've had a long time interest in something that is rarely discussed, and that is the impact that women suffer in countries where there are no robust religious freedom protections. So the idea of linking both religious freedom and post-war, pre-war, during war situation with the plight of women is something that not only is of great interest, but is oftentimes unexplored. And this is a pity because in a study conducted by Dr. Valerie Hudson at Texas A&M University, who focuses on security issues, And by the way, this is a mathematical data study. This is an empirical study, not only a qualitative study. She arrived to the conclusion with her team after 3 years of analyzing the data that the number one predictor of a state's ability to achieve peace and reconciliation was how they treated their women, how women were treated in society. And her study, which I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to look at, it's statswomen.com at Texas A&M, proves something that we need to dig deeper. So in my brief remarks, what I would like to do is talk about 3 places where women fight for basic rights amidst conflict, after conflict, and away from conflict. The first one is Afghanistan, where everyone here knows there has been an enormous issue with war for a very long time. There are 2.5 million widows in Afghanistan. And it seems like their plight doesn't end when they become a widow, but it starts when they become a widow. Most of these women are married before they turn 18. So as a result, the average age of a widow in Afghanistan is 35 years old. 94% of these widows are illiterate. And unfortunately, their tradition dictates that the men provide shelter, the women bear the children, and they stay at home. Sadly, in Afghanistan, most of these widows, if the average age is 35, are not even women, they're just girls. In rural communities, after she spends a year in mourning, the married brother-in-law takes her on as a second wife. So not only do you have to go through the humiliation of being a widow, but now you're forced into marriage with your married brother-in-law. Widows also suffer from social isolation. They're not allowed to attend weddings, they're not allowed to talk loudly, they're not allowed to wear makeup, and they're not allowed to enjoy themselves. There was a terrible story as I was investigating this deeply about a 16-year-old whose husband was killed 7 months after she got married. Well, it turns out that there's a tradition in Afghanistan that if your husband suffers a terrible tragedy within 10 months of getting married, it means that you have cursed the family and brought disgrace to the family. And therefore, you're no longer allowed to get married to anyone else because obviously you bring misfortune wherever you go. Let's go to Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, many women have absolutely no options, so they try to marry young. And if you become a war widow, your property goes to the family of the husband. You no longer have property. You no longer have a way to live. So many of these women fall prey to scams where they are told that if they go to this job agency, they're going to be able to work. And oftentimes, they are taken to other countries like Oman, where they're locked in a room every evening. They're allowed to go out to clean people's houses, and they're locked in those rooms again at night. There is no compensation for these women. There's no vehicle. Most of these women are illiterate. And in Oman, the government hasn't set up a mechanism for these women to ask for assistance. Post-war, escaping war, what happens in refugee camps to many of these women? I'll just bring one example in Greece. Many of the women who flee conflict come from different backgrounds and different religions. There are many stories of families that convert to Christianity in Turkey. The husband is killed, the women with the family flee to other countries like Greece, and once they get to those refugee camps, the whole dynamic that exists in the Middle East exists in a microcosm. In many cases, their tents are set on fire, they're kicked out of camps, they're told to go outside and beg, and when they call the police, oftentimes the police says they're too afraid of the mobs to come in and intervene. It's a dire picture, but I'm one for action, not one to just walk away sad. So this is a great opportunity for us. This challenge presents a great opportunity, and that is that in all of these cases, had these countries had robust religious freedom protections, had these countries had an educated population and religious leadership abided by laws that protected these women wouldn't lose their property, they wouldn't lose the ability to raise their children, they would be in a much better situation. And why is this an opportunity? Because about a year ago, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, where I serve as vice chair, started to explore the idea of women's rights and religious freedom and the intersectionality. To a person we talked to, they said that this would be a repulsive idea for the feminist movement because, after all, religion is medieval, retrograde, something that oppresses women. And my experience has been entirely the opposite. Every time I have met with women's groups that advocate for women's rights, they have agreed 100% that robust religious freedom protections in these countries would benefit women greatly. So whether these women are working with victims of female genital mutilation, which is oftentimes done in the name of religion, by the way, falsely, there's no religion that calls for this, or whether these women groups are dealing with honor killings or with patriarchal societies that leave their women behind, to a person. So we can, first of all, we can double the amount of advocates for women's rights and for religious freedom if we collaborate and use coalitions. Second, everyone today is talking about war and the terrible effects of war. We had the first minister-level meeting on religious freedom, and people forget that one of the greatest declarations on human rights came out at a time that we had just ended a war. In 1948, imagine all those delegates getting together to talk about the lofty goals of human rights. There was famine. There were people who didn't have a place to live, people who were mourning their entire family being killed in the Holocaust. And precisely because of the experience of World War II and the Holocaust and the pictures that came out of the Holocaust, these people got together and said, we must have a Declaration on Human Rights. That moment is now. This fall will be the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's time for us to form a collaborative relationship to all of these ministers in all of these countries that were here yesterday. Think about it. While we were meeting in our side events and talking about these issues, there were 82 like-minded countries who were telling our State Department here in Washington, D.C., what they were planning to do about the promotion of religious freedom, as Ambassador Brownback said. In closing, I like to say that last year I was invited to go to Oxford University with a colleague of mine to present the report that USERF had just finished. My first thought was of my father, who never Cuban, he escaped Fidel Castro's Cuba, and one of his biggest challenges in life was learning English. So he was very proud that his children, in spite of having an accent, spoke English. And I thought my father would be super excited that I'm going to Oxford. He passed away 10 years ago, because the best English in the world is spoken in Oxford. I'm like, yes. So I over-prepared for the presentation. I read everything. I read all the reservations and all the UN laws. And someone, actually, it was my colleague here, Dr. Peter Petkoff, towards the end of the conversation said, wait a second, if it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are women subhuman, superhuman? And at the time, I quipped, well, superhuman, but I wasn't ready. Well, okay, it's okay to laugh, we know. At the time, it occurred to me, it was a very serious question that all of a sudden we would have to tease away women's rights from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as if the word human did not include women. Ladies and gentlemen, sadly, at the time of the declaration, it was those people in the concentration camps that were considered subhuman by the German regime, and they were killed in the millions. Sadly, right now, we have to make sure that women in all of these countries, particularly in war-torn situations, are not treated as subhuman, and we have to stand by them so that they have the same dignity and the same rights that everyone in the universal community of humans should have as well. So I encourage you not to think about all the bad things only, but to think about how these challenges present terrific opportunities for us to collaborate and work together on these issues that come to the core of who we are, and the right that allows us to live according to our deeply held convictions. I cannot think of any work more important than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. And now I would like to invite John Allen to deliver his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. If I seem dazed and confused to you this morning, I apologize. In the last week and a half, I have been in Rome, then in Denver, Colorado, then in Los Angeles, California, and finally Las Vegas, Nevada, before arriving here in DC tonight. I barely have any sense of what time zone I'm in or what I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm a journalist. I think you come to expect confusion and the occasional fog of verbiage. I am the editor of an online Catholic news site called Crux. That is CRUX. It is found at cruxnow.com. It is cruxnow.com, where for a long time now we have had a particular focus on issues of anti-Christian persecution. The important thing, I think, is to note that we approach this topic not as they do in the heady environs of Washington from a policy perspective, but instead we try to tell the stories of victims. We try to get out into the field, meet the people who are suffering as a result of anti-Christian persecution and violations of religious freedom, and put faces and names on the broad picture with which we are all familiar. We all know this is a world in which violations of religious freedom occur on a staggering scope and scale. If we are to talk specifically about Christians, the low-end estimate for the number of new Christian martyrs every year in the world today is around 8,000. The high-end estimate is somewhere close to 100,000. Now, however you run those numbers, what that works out to is a Christian dying for his or her faith either every 5 minutes or every hour of every year, and often in the most staggering and grotesque fashion you can imagine. So to try to bring home the drama, the human drama of this story, what I would like to do is simply tell you about three victims of anti-Christian persecution I have met over the last, say, 5 years. We can begin with Nabil Solomon in Egypt. Nabil is the closest thing to an analog of the biblical figure of Job I have ever encountered. In 2013, Nabil was serving as a Christian security guard in his village in Upper Egypt. It was a secure middle-class position. His family enjoyed basic stability and harmony with their environment. After the Muslim Brotherhood government was dislodged in Egypt, a backlash of anti-Christian rage swept through this part of Egypt. A mob of jihadist Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers entered Nabil's village. They grabbed him at the mayor's office where he was paid to be the security guy. They also set fire to his home, and they basically chased his wife and 4 children from that home. The children, sorry, the children fled immediately to Cairo. Nabil's wife stayed behind because she wanted to be with him. What happened was the mob that grabbed him paraded him through the streets of the village. They invited people to punch, kick, and spit upon him. He was then brought into a police station where a sort of impromptu rump trial was conducted, in which he was found guilty of murdering a kind of local thug, who, by the way, abundant witnesses would document was in a village 300 miles away on the day that this murder allegedly took place, and that Nabil was at home on the job. In other words, there was no physical possibility he could have committed this crime. Yet, he was told that he had two choices. One, he had to get out of the village, or two, if he ever came back, he would be, these charges of murder would be reinstated, he would be prosecuted and eventually executed. By the way, he was also told he would be leaving without his pension, property, bank accounts, or anything that had once belonged to him. So he and his wife set out for Cairo. I met him in Cairo 3 years ago, where Nabil is living in and Cairo, as you know, has some of the most extreme poverty in the world, but this is one of the worst neighborhoods in some of the roughest areas of Cairo. He has a two-room apartment which now contains his children, grandchildren, his wife, and himself. It has no electricity or running water. The choices, basically, on a summer day, which is when we were there, are to open a window which looks out onto an open sewer, so that if you open that window, the immediate influx of flies is so overwhelming you think you're in a scene from the book of Exodus, or you leave it shut and essentially suffocate from heat. Nabil, by the way, is one of roughly 10 million Egyptians who are infected with hepatitis C. And he no longer can afford the medications necessary to hold it at bay. So this is, in effect, a slow-motion death sentence. Okay? That's Nabil's situation. Let me talk briefly about Rebecca Beatrice, a young Nigerian woman I met in Rome earlier this year in April, when she had an audience with Pope Francis that was organized by Aid to the Church in Need. Rebecca is a victim of Boko Haram. She had lived, very simple, illiterate young woman. She had lived in a small village in small, predominantly Christian village, which is an anomaly in northern Nigeria, which is largely Muslim. One day in 2014, Boko Haram gunmen stormed into her village. People immediately fled. She was separated from her husband, but managed to hold on to her two small children. They were 7 and 5 at the time, two small sons. And they split out for a nearby forest. They were eventually captured and brought into a Boko Haram camp, where Rebecca, along with the other young women who had been captured, at gunpoint, was asked to convert to Islam. When she declined, she was struck in the head with the butt of the rifle. When she declined again, one of the gunmen decided that she needed an object lesson in the failures of compliance. So they grabbed her 5-year-old son and threw him into the river, this raging river that was right by the camp, and forced her to watch him drown. And then gave her the choice of watching that again with her older son or going along. She chose to go along, although, as she describes it, this is always with a mental reservation. In fact, during the 5 times daily when she was compelled to do the Islamic prayer, she says she was actually in her mind reciting the rosary. When the camp was, by the way, she was then forcibly married to one of the Boko Haram members and forced to endure for months on end what amounted to serial acts of rape. She conceived a child and gave birth to this child in the camp. When the camp was finally liberated by the Nigerian army 2 years into this experience, she and her son once again took refuge, well, they took off, fleeing for their lives, again into the forest. She brought her older son, but fully intended to leave the younger son in the forest because she felt that he was not meant to be her child. That it was in fact a penalty of war. Her older son, rather, however, pleaded with her, saying that I have lost my brother, perhaps he can be my brother. So Rebecca picked him up again. They eventually returned to their village and made it to a larger town in northern Iraq where they felt they would be safe, or northern Nigeria, sorry, where they felt they would be safe. And there she was persuaded by the local pastor to accept this boy as her own son. She had him baptized with the name of Christophe. Today, she says, she has forgiven those who did this to her in the spirit of Christ on the cross, that she wants no vengeance, she wants no payback. She says she is simply interested in making sure that other young Christian women in her nation do not undergo the same experiences. And finally, let me mention Kanaka Nayak, who I had an opportunity to meet in India when we were doing reporting there 3 or 4 years ago. Kayaka is one of the so-called widows of Kandhamal. Kandhamal, if you don't know, was the most widespread and brutal anti-Christian pogrom anywhere in Asia in the early 21st century. It unfolded in 2008 when bands of radical Hindu militants, outraged by the slaying of a local holy man, stormed into largely Christian villages and performed atrocities that almost boggle the imagination in the 21st century. Kanaka's husband was a Baptist preacher who was grabbed by these Hindu militants. He was dragged into the central square of his village. He was kicked and stoned as his assailants insisted that he reconvert to Hinduism, even though he was born Christian. When he refused, they then buried him up to the neck in the square for 3 agonizing days, inviting people to kick him in the head, to throw stones at him, to abuse him in any manner they liked. On the 3rd day, they took him out, realized that he was not going to convert, and so they then strapped him to a pole where they cut his throat, sliced open his belly, ripped out his intestines, put them around their necks, and paraded around the village, sporting them as sort of macabre war trophies. Kanaka, when you talk to her today, like Rebecca, is stunningly free of rancor, despite having witnessed those horrors and her small children having been forced to witness them. She too has processed this spiritually as an invitation to forgiveness, an invitation to the participation in the sufferings of Christ on the cross. She too, however, says that her main interest right now is creating a climate in India in which her fellow Christian sisters and brothers do not have to fear similar experiences. I think the conclusion of all of this is, yes, it is a fascinating question to analyze the impact of war on violations of religious freedom. I think the no-brainer conclusion is that war generally is not good for religious freedom. We see that today all around the planet, but I think the more important implication, and there are 2. One is for victims of violations of religious freedom and anti-Christian persecution. They are already in a war. they suffer the same trauma. They suffer the same long-term legacy. They suffer the same agony. They suffer the same fear for the future as victims of any other sort of conflict. So however we analyze ultimately the roots of religious freedom, we need to recognize that these are war victims among us who need the same kinds of support, the same kind of care, the same kind of accompaniment as victims of all violent and traumatic conflict. I think the other point is that for those of us in the West, it is easy sometimes to think of violations of religious freedom as an event, something that happens and then is over with. We talk about the Kandhamal pogrom in 2008 as if it is now a closed chapter of history. It happened back then, and we write about it in history books and anniversaries and retrospectives. But for the people whose lives were scarred that day, this is not closed. Violations of religious freedom for them are not an event. They are a legacy. They become their lives. They define, in many ways, both the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual challenges of the rest of their lives. We may think, for instance, in northern Iraq, and I just got back from the Nineveh Plains in northern Iraq, we may think in northern Iraq, if we succeed in rebuilding the Nineveh Plains and helping those Christians get back to their homes who were driven out by ISIS, we may think that's job done. It isn't. Putting up a home is the beginning of the recovery process, not the end. So I can only echo everything you have heard and will hear from the other speakers on this panel about the urgency of this issue. And I promise you that at Crux, we are going to keep telling the human stories, I think, that demonstrate why, in my view, this is the most compelling and often the most undertold Christian story of the early 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now Steve Gumer is going to share with us his perspectives, which are from the fields, humanitarian relief, Christian perspectives on humanitarian relief, and seeing things through a different lens.
Thank you, Dr. Petkoff, and thank you all for arranging this, particularly Bruderhof Communities. I'm grateful. For the past 24 years, my team and I have been working mostly in Myanmar and the surrounding countries, helping in the ethnic states where either forced displacement, ethnic cleansing, or outright genocide has been taking place, largely in the pursuit of natural resources or the control of those resources. You may know that the Myanmar Army is the 12th largest conventional army on the planet and is run not against external enemies, but is run in the pursuit of control of these resources and power. In 2012, you may remember attacks making the news in Rakhine State in the city of Sittwe. Those attacks didn't happen in a vacuum, and they warrant discussion this morning. When I think about religious persecution, I'm not only thinking about Christian persecution or freedom. I'm thinking about the freedom a human being should have to choose their faith and express it. In 2012, it is alleged that a Rohingya person brutally raped a Buddhist young girl in Rakhine State just outside of Sittwe. In reprisal for that, a mob of Rakhine, native Rakhine people, stopped a bus on its way to a pilgrimage to the Hajj to go to Mecca and brutally dismembered and killed everyone on that bus. After that, there were other various reprisals, and it's largely believed by the communities, the aid organizations, and the political watchdogs of this, the human rights organizations, that this was state-sponsored violence. State-sponsored violence in order to provoke sectarian violence. State-sponsored violence in order to provoke two major religious groups to war and to harm one another. The riots that happened after that resulted in 150,000 people being forced into a floodplain just outside of the city of Sittwe and surrounded by barbed wire and protecting state authorities. Every single person that we interviewed after that violence, as we were going there to help them survive this acute crisis, every single person said that the riots were not Buddhists versus Muslims. The riots were mixed with state police and army soldiers who were provoking the burning down of these Rohingya homes, who were provoking the terrible atrocities that are well documented as a part of that event. We interviewed one woman named Masuda, and I'd like to tell you briefly her story just to illustrate what they went through because of this state-sponsored violence. Masuda is a part of a fishing family. When the violence broke out and they were being forced from their homes, her and her 49 relatives got on a fishing boat and made their way down a small tributary towards the ocean where they were hoping to find safety. Attacking and rioting mobs followed them, saw their ship, got in a smaller boat and set into this river, attached their boat to this larger boat, and proceeded to kill the relatives of Masuda one by one in the most brutal ways, mostly with knives and swords. Masuda jumped out of the ship while she was watching one of her granddaughters be molested and killed and grabbed onto something that was floating. They were in the process of sinking this fishing vessel. The last thing she remembers is seeing the flash of her family being killed, while she was hanging onto a floating object, she passed out. She was drugged from the water downriver and miraculously survived. That night, all 49 of her relatives, including her husband and her 5 children, were killed in the most brutal ways. When we interviewed her and her only surviving relative, who was a young grandson, I don't remember how he survived, when we interviewed them, she kept screaming and saying that she heard the ghosts of her family, and she would walk down to the water each night to try to put to rest these terrible, traumatizing emotions that she was feeling. The violence continued through the years from 2012 up until last August, and you may remember on August 25th seeing images in our newspapers of 17 villages that were on fire. The villages that were set fire were not because of rioting Rakhine people. Some of them participated, but this violence was initiated by state police and the Myanmar army. Those 17 villages over the months turned into more than 300 cases of villages being destroyed. And the stories that we heard and documented as we received these fleeing civilians in Bangladesh were those that were referenced in the first panel. These are well-documented stories of the worst type. And now Reuters News just documented the hundreds of thousands, in fact, of children that are being born right now in Bangladesh because of the policy of systematic rape that is encouraged among the armed forces and the police in Myanmar. You don't have to dig deep to see that religion is used as a means of division. Religion is used as a means to divide these people from one another. For as long as the Karen people in Western Burma or Eastern Burma have been resisting the regime, more than 50 years, the regime has used the premise of keeping peace between Buddhists and Muslims and folk religion practitioners as a reason to go in and burn down villages and do these terrible things that are well documented. Our team, our small team in Partners Relief and Development, have been involved in this violence, involved in helping the victims since 1994. In 2012, the only way to help the victims that were surrounded by barbed wire was to go into that camp subversively. I met one USAID official and talked to him about more substantial funding because the numbers were overwhelming. And the funding couldn't be given to us because we weren't willing to negotiate an MOU with the very body doing the killing. And that's the Myanmar regime. And that is also the reason that we're still there, but none of those other large agencies are there. And the projects that the Myanmar regime approved for them to do were only symbolic and small. And the logos that were allowed to be placed on buildings that have stayed locked since 2012, the clinics that were established to supposedly care for the Rohingya, none of them actually functioned except on the days of monitoring and evaluation. And it was all a mockery of justice and humanity. My point with that story is that our interaction with Myanmar has to consider the fact that the regime is guilty of the crime that I'm talking about. The regime is doing the killing and has marginalized these people. And Masuda and her overwhelming number of kin who suffer because of this ongoing systematic denial of justice, they suffer in part because of our policies, our foreign policies, and our approach to this country and the conflicts that are going on there, and our geopolitical and economic interests. It warrants reflection. 3 days ago, I was in Aleppo and with an assessment team looking at projects that our team has initiated 3 years ago and has continued to run through the 3 years of war in all of the major cities in Syria. We were asked by the government in Kurdish Syria to help children whose families have been killed or who have witnessed such traumatic events that they are dysfunctioning, both in school and in family or in society. I asked if I could meet some of those children so that I could get a better handle on who we're talking about and the ages of these kids. And they took me to visit 3 siblings and their grandmother who survived what they say is an ISIS attack in the city of Kobani. Kobani is a city of over 1 million people where 80% of the buildings were flattened by ISIS, and all of the terrible atrocities that have been considered or documented as acts of war happened. I walked into this compound and first met the grandmother, who pointed to her nose, which was half missing, and she said that when ISIS came into our home, first they brutally killed my daughter, then they brutally killed her husband, my son-in-law, and that happened in front of these 3 children, their mother and father. Then they shot me in the nose. I fell over and they shot me again in the hip, and she pulled her skirt up so I could see the bullet wound on her hip. She told me this while she was weeping, 76-year-old woman who had already told this story to journalists. And one of her reflections is, what good is it to tell you what happened when you will leave also and we will still be hungry? The fighters, thinking that the grandmother was dead, then turned their attention to the siblings. They attempted to remove the left leg of the youngest sibling, a little girl who was 9 months old. They attempted to remove her left leg with a knife. They stopped halfway through this terrible process for reasons I don't know. But this little girl is left now with a permanent disability and a scar to prove the violence that happened to her. Then they went to the oldest sibling, another girl who was 3 years old, and they cut her pinky off with a knife. For some reason, they left the boy untouched. They turned around and they left the apartment. This helps all of us understand the human story, the narrative behind the metrics of war, and the brutality of these terror groups as they use religion as a means to destroy both pluralistic society and the harmony that was experienced in this country before the war. course, there were massive divides and problems, especially between the Sunnis and the Shiites. But largely, they lived as neighbors in a state of neighborly friendliness. I was told by many people in Syria that behind their suffering are the weapons and the training of the United States. And it broke my heart. When I thought that it was al-Nusra doing the killing, or ISIS doing the killing, I even went on camera to tell people about what was happening. I was corrected after my interview that no, this wasn't ISIS, this was Nusra. And all of the villagers in this destroyed village agreed that it was Nusra. And when they pointed out the destruction of their life and livelihood, they said that it's not just al-Nusra, it's US weapons and training, it's Saudi, it's Qatar and their allies. And so when I was invited while on my way to Syria by Bruderhof, I felt it was, I felt that I don't have that much to contribute because I don't work in this space of diplomacy or foreign policy. I work in the space of political complexity and violence to feed children who are starving, something that all of us could raise our hands and participate in. I know that. But then I thought being invited to this podium and being a voice at this place was important. I met hundreds of Syrian Christians who reached out to me, who sacrificially served their Shiite and their Sunni neighbors, who talked about a return to the pluralistic society that they once enjoyed in major cities like Aleppo and Homs and Damascus, who talked about the power of reconciliation and forgiveness and exercised it, who were sacrificially in front of me organizing feeding kitchens for Shiites who were released outside of Idlib just 4 days ago. I watched it all happen, and I watched their attitude that was overwhelmingly seasoned with love. And for me, when I think about the answer to the world's problems, to the wars that we're facing, that we're confronted with today, and even foreign policy, as naive as it sounds, we should have some common sense and be overwhelmingly motivated by love. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. And now we have a few moments to continue the conversation in a more informal fashion. And I was hoping that I could persuade my panelists to engage with some of the emerging questions from this heartbreaking witness, particularly going back to the very question of the panel. What is the impact of war on religious freedom, but also what might be the impact of religious freedom on war? What difference is it going to make, whether we're talking again about conventional war or cultural wars, whether religious freedom thrives or whether it's curbed for various strategic reasons. As we all know, war is often about ethnic cleansing, about clearing the fields and creating safe haven for particular ideologies, which also means removing those who in some way do not fit into the caliber of those particular ideologies. So how do we bring religious freedom into the equation in this situation? And what difference is it likely to make on the ground? So, shall we have the first round of reflections on that?
Well, I think it is obvious to say that war is one of the great enemies of religious freedom, but I think it is equally obvious to say that religious freedom is one of the great antidotes to war. Pope Paul VI, who, by the way, is going to be canonized this October, used to say that to end war, work for justice. Well, it is quite clear that an application of that principle today would be to end war, work for religious freedom. Let's take a situation like Iraq, where I just returned from there. It is stunningly obvious to anyone on the ground in Iraq today that there really are only two long-term trajectories for that country's future. Okay, one is a continued slide into ethnic and religious tensions in which it is turned into one of the world's largest living Christian-free zones. The numbers of Christians in Iraq prior to the first U.S. invasion in 1993 were estimated to be over 2 million when we went back in 2003. Or 91, sorry. When we went back in 2003, it was estimated to be 1.5 million. Today, the high-end estimate, the robust estimate you will get from officialdom in the church is 350,000. Realistically, most people who are on the ground think it's closer to around 200,000. So, this is a short-term slide into extinction. And that's true not just of the Christians, obviously, but of the Yazidi minority as well. And so one trajectory is a kind of minority-free zone in which what you have is, therefore, a war of all against all between Sunnis and Shias for ultimate control of the prize. In such a scenario, we're talking about an Iraq that is increasingly radicalized, an Iraq that is increasingly militarized, that is destabilizing, and that will be a long-term sort of geopolitical headache for the foreseeable future. The other option is that Iraq finds a way forward to become a constitution-based society in which minorities, the rights of minorities, are not only recognized on paper but protected in practice, in which Christians will have an opportunity, Christians and others will have an opportunity to make their contributions. That is very much the dream for which young Christian Iraqis today are fighting. If you ask them how confident it is, how they are, that they will live to see that dream, they will all express fairly deep skepticism about it, frankly. But nevertheless, many of them are willing to invest their lives in trying to achieve it. Look, this is why when Secretary Brownback said earlier that we need to engage the security people on this, I mean, this is, since I began reporting on anti-Christian persecution around the world decade and a half ago, it has been stunning to me how this never seems to come up in national security conversations, because it is abundantly clear that the United States has a strategic interest in Iraq. I would think our two incursions would have demonstrated that. It is a pivotal part of the world. We have a vital interest in which way that society goes, and religious freedom is a core, perhaps the core. You're never going to understand a society like Iraq if you look at it just through geopolitics and military and economic and security considerations, because religion is the beating heart of that society and always has been. So it would seem to me that if we are concerned with conflict resolution in the early 21st century, how you can possibly have that conversation without considering the religious freedom dimension of it is just, to me, unthinkable.
And one of the things which seems to emerge in Middle Eastern context, particularly experts who work on Syria and Iraq, is that they're adamant that looking into conflict resolution through the lens of human rights and religious freedom in particular is far more effective than focusing on religion and the demographics of religion, simply because they reflect that religion is a divisive aspect in the Middle Eastern societies. And this is why actually finding reconciliation through the lens of human rights and religious freedom as well is more likely to work rather than focusing on religion, which could potentially be seen as a threat on the ground, which brings me to a question which I wanted to raise with Christina, perhaps, which is religion and religious freedom in particular clashing with issues of national security concern, particularly in places like Russia. In Russia, there is a particular concept in several of their national security doctrines, which were adopted by successive presidents, that there is something like religious beliefs which are considered as a threat to national security, that religious plurality in some way could be seen as undermining the traditional values and the traditional religious ideas of Russia's society. And this is certainly emerging in other contexts beyond Russia. So how could we really push this agenda out of the equation, out of the debate, and really make a stronger case that religious freedom is more likely to be the paradigm shift where we could find a more common denominator?
Thank you. Yes, Russia is having a particular difficulty dealing with the idea that people should have a conscience that's independent from the state. And this is a situation that oftentimes is used as an excuse to say, well, it's a matter of national security to make sure we get rid of extremist groups. So the Russian government in particular has come up with how to identify an extremist group. The first way to identify an extremist group is a group that promises salvation. Well, I don't know about any religion that doesn't. So, of course, this is an issue. Second, issues having to do with money, financing from another state. And the list goes on and on. And the two groups that have been particularly targeted in the recent past have been the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Scientologists. These two groups have been identified extremist groups. Many of their publications are now categorized as extremist publications. By the way, for those of you who have studied Hinduism, all Hindu texts in Russia at one point 2 years ago were considered extreme texts. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have now become entirely illegal in Russia. And so have the Scientologists. They have been, many of them are now suffering arrest. They have tried to flee the country. But I think a bigger philosophical issue about this is the fact that since time immemorial, there have been excuses for us to hate the other, to make sure that the other didn't come a part of our community. And these new trends to make it more palatable for us to accept that the other doesn't deserve the same rights that we do has become rather sophisticated. I was very moved by all the stories you told about Myanmar. I was there last year. It's a very complex and terrible situation. And of course, I was very moved by the stories you told as well. But I think it would be an injustice for me not to say the following. We are not a perfect country at all. But I'm a refugee in this country. My parents escaped Fidel Castro's Cuba. My mother was in a concentration camp in Germany. And we are still the freest country in the world. We have poured trillions of dollars in assistance into all the countries that have been mentioned. All of the difficulties that were mentioned earlier did not happen because America trained people or gave them weapons. It happened because it is human nature that people are going to fight over ethnicity and race and religious belief. So it would be a great disservice to blame one particular country as the instigator or the provider of weaponry or tools for these issues. We are in this together. We didn't make it happen. We have been trying to assist imperfectly, granted, but the United States government, for all of its faults, is the only country that has hosted a minister-level conference just to speak about how we can assist other countries to improve their situation having to do with religious freedom. And it has invited faith-based organizations from all over the world to apply for USAID grants that are funded by American taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. There is something I wanted to turn the conversation towards with Steve, particularly in the context of humanitarian relief. There is this sense that while the stage of humanitarian relief is associated with the idea that help is there, and we are to improve the conditions of people who have lost their homes, who are on the run, and yet there appear to be reports that very often in refugee camps there is a segregation of refugees, and this segregation is often on the basis of religion or belief, that Christians are not welcome in camps dominated by Sunni refugees. Very often, as a result of that, Christian churches set up their own operations and create their own comfort zones. And I was just wondering whether you could reflect more on these emerging trends and whether religious freedom as an opportunity to create a melting pot and an understanding that we are all together in this, and we have to find a way out of it, and the reconciliation in crisis is a very important part of it, is emerging through your work.
Where I've experienced this firsthand is with the Rohingya, and they are largely nominal Muslims who don't identify with either sect, either major sect, and who view Christianity as a threat to their culture and their future, and who have historically treated converts to Christianity with terrible unkindness, and who also would not be open to the idea of Christian churches or Christian worship happening. Through the conflict since 2012, however, I've seen a softening of that, and we have been clear with the Rohingya that from the beginning that we're Christians, that we come to serve and love without the motive of converting them. And having done that, they welcome us and have treated us as friends, even when missionaries were largely kicked out of one of those cities, Sittwe, in 2013. So I have seen and experienced what you're talking about, Dr. Petkoff. Also, a little bit in Syria. The Sunni and the Shia refugees are definitely not in the same camps, at least the ones that I have visited. And even last week, I was with a group of Christians, and we talked to one of the ministers in their parliament, who invited us to help rebuild with development projects and infrastructure what he called the pluralistic society that he had been a part of. I asked him what sect he belonged to, and he said, well, I don't actually think about that, and most of my friends don't either. This is just what he said. He said that whether you're Shia or Sunni or Christian or Alawite or otherwise, we are neighbors and we'll work together. I don't know how much of an anomaly that is, but I experienced it directly last week. And then the final example that I think of is the people that I was with were largely Coptic Christians and Orthodox Christians who had dedicated the last 3 years of their lives to helping people who found themselves stuck in the rubble of this war to rebuild, to find safe haven, and to be provided for. Those would be examples of your question, and the answer is yes. Religious freedom would contribute to a decrease in the suffering of these people.
Doctor, if I might, on this question of the refugee camps specifically, let me just give you the experience of the Christians of Iraq. As most of you probably know, the Christians from the north who were driven out by ISIS mostly took refuge in Kurdish-controlled territories, largely Erbil. And those anywhere else in the country typically took refuge in Syria, or not in Syria, but in Lebanon, in some cases in Jordan. In both of those cases, the Christians deliberately chose not to enter, not to settle in the large UN-sponsored refugee camps, largely because they feared that those camps might have been compromised by the same jihadist forces who had driven them from their homes in the first place. So they instead turned entirely to the church. In Erbil, seriously, I mean, for a couple of years, 2014, most of 2013, it was like Dunkirk. You would walk. They had these big, metal shipping containers that had been deployed under the grounds of shrines and basilicas and convents and seminaries, and people would take shelter there, waiting for a more permanent solution. The church, with the assistance of international groups such as the Knights of Columbus, Aid to the Church in Need, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, the Catholic Relief Services, the local church there was the only form of support. They were the only firebreak between these people and starvation, death because they couldn't get their medications, complete lack of schooling for their children, and so forth and so on. And to add, to make this more complicated, the public support, and what makes the announcement that was made at the ministerial this week so potentially promising, is that public support for refugees in Iraq and Syria, which is administered through either states or intergovernmental organizations, is almost entirely distributed through those large camps, which has meant that the Christian displaced persons, the Christian refugees, basically speaking, have never gotten any of it. For instance, to this day, there has never been a dime of U.S. public funding directly allocated to be administered by church organizations on the ground in Iraq, who are the primary, in fact, the exclusive caregivers for these people, which is what makes this public-private partnership that we're now talking about so potentially important. It's what makes efforts in the pledges of Vice President Pence and others that some share of U.S. funding for genocide relief in Iraq and Syria will be allocated for administration directly by church actors and other minority-led organizations there. Because if we are relying on the major international organizations to take care of these people, experience to date would suggest it simply is not going to happen.
Thank you. Christina, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you. Yes, I find the situation in Iraq to be particularly heartbreaking. I was also just there in Erbil, but I also see a lot of hope. And that is that the Christians who are there, again, at 200,000, many of them do want to stay and are starting to rebuild themselves. The Telskov, for instance, and I'm sure you were there as well, met with Valer Salar, an incredible man. It has received direct assistance, $2.2 million from the Hungarian government. About 1,200 homes have been rebuilt, so 1,200 families have moved back in. And yes, I have no doubt, I mean, the vice president himself has admitted that the fact that no USAID assistance has reached Christians in the region is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be fixed. But not everything can be fixed by government entities. Samaritan's Purse, for instance, has a very active charity in Iraq where they are assisting all of the minority religious groups in the area. They're helping the Yazidis, for instance, start sheep. I forget the name in English, like shepherding. Well, they're giving them sheep and doing things and helping them develop a new grassroots economy. And what they did, Samaritan's Purse, and again, it makes me very hopeful. What they did is they made sure that the Yazidi families are helping each other in community. So they are not in competition for this business, but they're helping each other. The situation of the refugee camps in many other parts of the world, sadly, there are a lot of issues for women in these camps. There are a lot of issues for children. There are a lot of issues for abuse. Some of these camps were set up to be functioning for 3 or 4 months. Some of them have been in existence for 7 or 8 years. Without a doubt, there are problems there. But I think in countries that have weak legal infrastructures and there is no rule of law, the refugee camps are exacerbating the already existing in-country sectarian issue. So it's a microcosm of what would happen anyway.
I was wondering whether I could turn the conversation in a slightly different direction and to look into the way religion is often instrumentalized in the context of military conflicts, and it's used to legitimize a particular position, justification of a particular form of hostilities, justification of a particular reshaping of societies, and also to look into the ways we could bring religious freedom discourse to really depart from these approaches. I can see that it is inevitable that in every military conflict we have to deal with the strange paradox that despite of hostilities, despite of the atrocities, the war crimes, the rapes, in the end, the hostilities and the atrocities of the few sooner or later lead to the shaping of culture, shaping of societies, shaping of social structures, and this could be done in 2 ways. If religion is instrumentalized and seen as a bastion of culture, as a safe haven to a particular intellectual cultural paradigm, then there is very little space for any alternative paradigms. Alternatively, if this process of reconsolidation after a war zone, after a war conflict, is seen as multi-centered political perfectionism, then there is more chances for different voices and different conversations to take place and reshape the society after a particular conflict. So I was wondering whether we could have a little conversation in this direction. How do we deal with this, with the fact that religion is increasingly being instrumentalized to legitimize departure from human rights instruments, justification of atrocities many of us thought have gone with the Second World War and maybe the wars in Yugoslavia?
Well, I mean, there is no doubt that religion often serves as a very convenient pretext for political dynamics in one direction or another. I mean, if we look at many of the populist movements that I think, many analysts would see as one of the most important political phenomenon on the global stage today, Erdogan in Turkey, no doubt, plays the Islamic card when it is convenient. Modi in India came to power, basically breaking a decade's, it was very clever actually, it was cynically exploitative, but clever too. The Congress Party seemed to have a stranglehold on power in India for a long time, and then, Modi and the forces behind him and the BJP realized that the only way to beat them was to appeal to the traditionalist, nationalist, sort of hardcore Hindu sentiment of the country, and they put together both a social movement and a political coalition that has ridden that to power. Today, most analysts would say that the most important long-term political trend in India is what they call saffronization. That is the sort of accelerated Hinduization of society and making non-Hindu religious alternatives therefore feel uncomfortable. In Europe, you can look at Hungary, Poland, both now ruled by governments that have strongly appealed and successfully appealed to traditional nationalist sentiments linked to religious identity. And so there is no doubt that politicians always will try to take advantage of pre-existing religious tensions to support agenda, whatever their perceived agenda may be. Very little that civil society and religious players can do to prevent that, except, I guess, not go along with it. But I think the more interesting question, and I will come back to this, is to what extent can religion serve not as a further corrosive, but as a corrective to some of these trends that you're talking about? I look at in Mali, in Africa, against all odds, this Saturday, Malians are going to head to the polls to try to elect a new president, despite the fact that there is a significant threat of a jihadist takeover of their country any time now. But nevertheless, in a spirit of defiance, they're going to try to keep their democratic institutions alive. Caritas, which is the Global Federation of Catholic Charities, the branch of Caritas in Mali, is going to be deploying 513 election observers. They are the only player in civil society that has been sanctioned by all political forces as trustworthy to ensure the validity of the election, that is, to ensure that it is free and fair. And of course, they're doing that motivated by religious beliefs. So I think it is easy to point to situations in the world where religion has served as the kind of spark that has lit a conflict, and when it continues to fuel it, because it is a very potent fuel for people who have vested interests in conflict. But my Theology 101 professor in college told me that just as there is a mystery of evil, there is also a mystery of good. Sometimes it is hard to explain situations such as Mali when people who have every reason to believe that this is a futile exercise nevertheless are so profoundly motivated by their convictions that they are willing to put their expertise and in some cases even their lives on the line in a kind of chaotic effort to hold the forces of darkness at bay. So I think we need to focus on that as well.
Yeah. Christina?
Yeah, the great sociologist Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree About Religion and Politics, talks about whether is religion part of the problem or part of the solution, and how do you, both, yes, and how do you break out of cycles, and in his book he says, religion binds and blinds, and no amount of truth or fact end up persuading a person who has taken on religion as their primary mode of understanding. Now, is that good or bad? So if I'm a Christian and I think that I should die for my fellow man, no amount of someone telling me is like, that's a bad idea, will persuade me otherwise, right? But in a situation like Mali, and I'm very interested in Mali, I'm glad you brought it up, I'll give you an example. Mali is actually a pretty pluralistic society. There are a number of religions. And a group studying out of the United Kingdom, studying female genital mutilation, went to Mali to understand why women from several different religions were still having their girls undergo FGM. So they put a training program together to say this is not religiously based, it's not healthy, there are all these risks. And in the end, the women would not change their minds. And in fact, many of the women said, I don't like the idea of doing this to my daughter. However, I just cannot justify not doing it. She will not get married. There were all these fears associated with it. No amount of reason, no amount of facts played into it, even when the scientific truth was explained. So what Jonathan Haidt concludes is that in order to persuade someone else, we have to be part of their tribe for a moment and really understand what their motivations are. And as a final point, freedom of religion or belief does not protect religion. What it protects is the people's ability to decide what they believe and to act accordingly. And regrettably, a lot of people hear religious freedom or freedom of religion belief, and they immediately think of the religion they like the least. I cannot tell you how many people in this field I've asked, do you believe in religious freedom? Yes, absolutely, except for the Mormons, or except for the Muslims, or except... So freedom of religion or belief has to do with protecting individuals, not asserting that one religion is better than the other, and not protecting religion, just the individual. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could now steer the conversation in another direction, and it is particularly the direction which tries to look into the ways we could make freedom of religion or belief a more credible narrative to deal with some of the conflicts, with some of the tensions we have flagged. For many years, at the policy level, freedom of religion or belief was seen as a rather awkward right for policymakers to engage with, and it was often seen as being important simply because religion makes people burn each other's houses, and therefore we need to understand and engage with freedom of religion or belief more as a way to contain conflict and the damage. Only recently we have started looking into good practices in more positive dimensions of freedom of religion or belief in terms of building social cohesion, building plural societies, building multiple dialogical spaces in a social context. But this hasn't yet made much changes as seeing freedom of religion and belief as a problem-fixing or problem-solving issue. And I was just wondering, from your work, whether you see a way forward, how to see freedom of religion and belief as a much more dynamic way of opening up strategies of building vibrant, dynamic, diverse society and cultures, and just going beyond this level of treating it as something which is there to fix a problem rather than create a vision, more long-term vision. Thoughts?
Sure. Last year, our team spent 9 months working with an armored division in the Nineveh Desert, where we have all been. And our job was to work at a casualty collection point, helping civilians. As ISIS was routed out, civilians would climb out of the rubble, and our team was there to help them with basic supplies, medical, and get them to a place of safety. One of the disturbing features of our work over those 9 months was that a lot of the soldiers who were Shiites were going into these Sunni civilian homes and just destroying them, just shooting their rifles at anything glass or anything breakable, and then stealing everything they could potentially sell or felt that they wanted. And our team tried to help them see that that's not going to help this war ever end. And it boils back down to my closing. And again, as naive as it sounds, well, it boils back down to the universal imperative or the golden rule, doing for these people what we would want done for us or to our own people. And we tried to reason with the Hashishabi militia, who was then fighting with the Iraqi army, and they wouldn't hear us at that time, but we did win some friends over to that, and somehow I believe that's the answer. If we can consider ourselves in their shoes and work towards a kind of reconciliation, and even with these soldiers at war to do their work with a level of dignity and not act as mobsters or terrorists themselves.
Yeah. Christine and John?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about the Nineveh Plains too, because it wouldn't be great if we could find a solution. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. Relational experiences, interfaith experiences, putting yourself as a member of the tribe you're talking to is vital. And that's why religious freedom has to be robust, right? Because once a country decides that one religion is more legitimate or important or justifiable than the other, then naturally we have these sectarian issues. I was also thinking about in the United States after 9/11, a lot of Sikhs who had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11 were attacked because 72% of Americans thought that anyone with a turban or a beard were Muslim, right? So the Sikh community has worked really hard in engaging and collaborating with other religious groups to raise awareness in the United States. So if we were able to do the same in a place like Iraq and have Sunni and Shia finally talk to each other and develop common bonds, that would be great. Unfortunately, in Iraq, the Iranian government has made sure that certain militias are incredibly well-funded, and they're buying Christians out of their homes, and they're changing the demographics. So there's a lot of resentment. So, in conclusion, again, you're right that freedom of religion or belief has been treated as the eccentric uncle of the human rights family. It doesn't help that we have a lot of our friends calling it a Western value, when in fact it isn't. It wasn't drafted as one. So in order to have a better understanding of that vital core right as essential to the promotion of the rest of the rights, I think we're going to have to do a bit more work in all the international fora.
Well, I agree with the instinct here, which is that there is a massive sales pitch that has to be made upon behalf of religious freedom on the global level and at the cultural grassroots, not just in the arenas of the academy and so on. But, you know, where ordinary people draw conclusions about where they want to go with their lives. The specific form of violation of religious freedom that I have focused on as a journalist is anti-Christian persecution. And I have long been stunned about the relative wall of silence in Western discussion, even within the confines of Western religious organizations, Christian churches in this country. The relative ignorance about the scale of the situation internationally, lack of awareness and so on. I don't really know how to explain that. All I can say is that it is completely unjustified, in the same way that you didn't have to be Jewish in the 1960s to be concerned about dissident Jews in the Soviet Union. And you didn't have to be black in the 1980s to be concerned about victims of apartheid in South Africa. You clearly do not have to be Christian today to be concerned about any human rights scourge that, according to the most sort of reliable estimate, puts 200 million people every day at risk of physical harassment, arrest, torture, imprisonment, and ultimately death.
simply for the mere fact of being a Christian. A human rights scourge that claims somewhere between one life every 5 minutes and one life every hour. Obviously ought to galvanize our attention regardless of what your religious conviction happens to be. That silence has to be broken. How do we do it? Well, I fundamentally agree that the key here is the human drama. I think, policy studies and surveys, these are all essential resources in trying to make this case. But ultimately, what brought people around about Soviet Jews in the 60s? It was really reading Solzhenitsyn. Coming into contact with someone who had experienced that in his own bones. In the 70s and 80s, what put apartheid front and center of our consciousness was coming to know Nelson Mandela, the story of Mandela. It was seeing a movie about Stephen Biko, and on, right? I think what we need right now, quite honestly, is that we need the Schindler's List of persecutions of religious freedom in the early 21st century. We need that slam dunk, heartbreaking, mesmerizing movie about Asia Bibi in Pakistan, or the Rohingya in Myanmar, or whoever it is, the victims of Kandhamal in India. I mean, I think ultimately it is personal narrative that reframes consciousness and ultimately drives history. And we're going to, in our journalistic piece of the patch, we are going to continue trying to tell those human stories that hopefully will serve as the raw material and stimulate the imagination of the most gifted storytellers of our time, because I think that's what this is going to take.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion, but as it always happens, good things do have to come to an end. So, and on this note, I would like to close this session, thank our speakers for their fascinating contribution.